The mythical figure of Pandora, the woman who is ostensibly responsible for linguistic chaos and therefore for translation, often appears in writing about translation. She is often used as one of the primal scenes of translation. The standard story is that she defied male authority and opened up a jar containing all the human evils, letting them out. And among those was linguistic chaos. Ever since, humans have had to translate in order to talk to each other, or humans at a distance from one another have had to translate to talk to each other. Critic Karin Littau points out that Pandora, that this image of Pandora, has acquired many different faces over the centuries and many different stories. Sometimes she's represented as Mother Earth, with an enormous overflowing cornucopia, a deity that oversees fruitfulness and regeneration, while the more dominant version tells only of her unleashing the world's ills. Sometimes she's represented as a femme fatale that lures men to destruction. Sometimes she's just a powerful stone figure, a sculpture of idealized womanhood. There are many versions of Pandora, and Littau suggests that, and here I quote, "The many Pandora myths lend emphasis not to the impossibility of translation, but the impossibility of putting a stop to endless retranslation." In short, they show us the serial nature of translation. There are always more translations, retranslations. What Pandora, her name, exposes is seriality, not just that there never was one text, one truth, but that there is always one more. This idea that there is never just one, but always one more, which Littau develops in association with feminist psychoanalysis by Luise, points to the dangers of claims that any translation of any text is the best or the true version, or finally gives us access to what the author really said. A translation is always a version. It's a different text that is always affected by cultural environments, by what I call the écologie culturelle, the context, and by sensitivities, by the intellectual climate in which it is produced and into which it is produced. A translation, like any other text, is never an absolute or final text. In fact, and here is the second theoretical principle, it is a demonstration and enactment of a principle of interdependence. A translation is dependent on the source text, and the source text is equally dependent on it for exposure, for readers, for interpretation and reinterpretation. Translation is ruled by this principle of interdependence, and we're going to hear more about it because here are the two translators who interdependently translated one book. Translation is ruled by this principle, which in turn reveals many other dependencies and more broadly, the connectedness underlying fictions of autonomy. I like that idea that we often think of ourselves as autonomous creatures and writing our own texts, but in fact, some of it is really quite fictitious and interdependence is unavoidable. So these ideas about the interdependent relationship between the source text, the original French text, and the translation have also been bolstered recently by reference to another feminist psychoanalyst, Bracha Lichtenberg-Ettinger, who studies the late prenatal moment in pregnancy, a moment that all humans have experienced, women often more consciously than men, but that has largely escaped traditional psychoanalytic thought. This moment is one where, in the eyes and in the work of this psychoanalyst Ettinger, where dependency is an ethical value. It's not separateness or oneness that's important, it's dependency that's important and is an ethical value. And where the new forms and shapes do not send the preceding ones into oblivion or eliminate them. Thus, the whole activity leads to an existence of multitude rather than unity. In fact, if we think about the late prenatal stage of pregnancy, there are 2 in 1 or 3 in 1 individuals quite able to function alone but still functioning together. The emphasis of this Ettinger at this moment is on what she calls the non-rejection of the non-I. and the I is a capital I, the non-rejection of the non-I, which is in fact the admission or the acceptance of the other. And this has been, over the last few years, a big problem or a big source of discussion in translation. It turns the translation, this whole moment, the principle of the non-rejection of the non-I, makes the translational relationship one of encounter, exchange, and mutual transformation. Translation becomes a threshold and not a frontier between two cultures, between two texts. This view offers a more nuanced approach to the difference that the source text represents. The source text is something very strange. Many of us here probably couldn't read it in French. It promotes a view of translation as generative, something that produces something, generates new knowledge, as a labor that, like all such work, and contrary to any ideas of solitary grandeur, is dependent upon and in conversation with its context, with this particular context tonight, for example, all the while exerting an influence on it as well. There's nothing finite about it. So in this vein, let us turn to our two very interdependent translators here, the generators of another Beauvoir, another version of what has been called the Feminist Bible, and a text that will continue to resonate in many different incarnations and in many different responses that people will have to it. Their work was very, very subject to this principle of interdependence. They worked as a team, and it'll be very interesting to hear how that actually panned out. Thank you.
Thank you, Luise. Thank you, Peter. How happy we are to be here in this wonderful city again. And we are especially touched that Barnard College, a school of great women, has invited us here. Thank you again, Peter, whom we met in Paris and who has shown such sensitive support to the project of this translation and to translation and to the great work itself. In November of 1949, Les Éditions Gallimard, Simone de Beauvoir's French publisher, published Le Deuxième Sexe. Simone de Beauvoir once said in her youth that literature had the quality of assuring her an immortality that would make up for lost eternity. Indeed, if ever a work would assure immortality, The Second Sex, translated into English in 1953, would be that work. Nothing she had done or written or that she wrote thereafter would compare with the impact of The Second Sex on France, on the world, and on history. Before discussing the actual translation of Le Deuxième Sexe, we want to say a few words about ourselves as the translators and what and whom we were translating. The sublime and daunting task of retranslating this great work for the first time in its entirety fell to us, and we were ready for it. We have both been living for over 40 years in Paris, teaching literature and American civilization in French universities, and writing English grammar and other books for French speakers. In the 1970s, as Luise said, we both studied and got degrees in linguistics in Paris, a hub of new thinking in language and social sciences. We saw the rise of the feminist movement in France, recalling for us our 60s college years feminism blossoming into a full-grown social movement. Certainly, one of Simone de Beauvoir's many attractions for us was her interest in the United States, just at the time of writing The Second Sex. She spent about a year in the United States in 1947. She was fascinated by American women and racial issues. She met and became friends with Richard Wright, Nelson Algren, of course, and was reading Gunnar Myrdal's book on America, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, that came out in 1944. The Second Sex is full of references to America and American women and men. She saw in action what it meant to be the other, came face to face with the master-slave relationship and other fundamental issues from probing into American society. Her gaze on American culture and the way she extracted ideas from it for the second sex, coupled with her own experience and knowledge of the two cultures and languages, informed our approach to the translation. We are old friends, as Luise said. We met in college and have known each other since we were 18. 60 years to the month after the publication in French of Le Deuxième Sexe, in November 2009, and 4 years after we started working on it in 2005, the new English translation came out by Jonathan Cape in the UK and in the United States by Knopf in April. It is particularly significant to note that new translations and editions are still coming out. Some countries are translating it for the first time, like Taiwan, or retranslating it from the French instead of from the English, like China. Greece's new translation is also forthcoming. Spain had a new one in 2005. We have met with other translators of the second sex, from Slovenia, Finland, from Norway and elsewhere, and have shared cares, questions, and experiences which are surprisingly similar in spite of our different languages. Simone de Beauvoir was already well known when she turned to the question of women in her famous work. She had already written novels, plays, and philosophical works, and her public persona was something to be noticed. While officially she came in second in the prestigious agrégation exam in philosophy, in reality, the first place had been given to Jean-Paul Sartre, who would become her life partner. She lived according to the principles of existentialism, which liberated her from her strict Catholic and bourgeois upbringing. She was shocking to some, a champion to others. When she wrote The Second Sex, she was writing a philosophical treatise, an essay about what it means to be the other in society, an idea key to existentialist philosophy. Simone de Beauvoir didn't consider herself to be a feminist until much later, but she came to recognize the condition of women as she progressed in the book. She said in The Force of Circumstance, one of her books of memoir in 1963, and I quote, "I never had the feeling of inferiority. No one ever said to me, 'You think this way because you are a woman.' My femininity never bothered me at all," end of quote. It was at Sartre's instigation and her desire to write about her own life, coupled with her philosophical background, that she wrote about the condition of women in general, about woman as other, the other sex, the second sex. This book has had repercussions all over the world. Again, as Luise said, it has been called the Bible, the keystone in women's history. The British hardcover edition is made to look like a Bible. It is totally white with the title embossed in white on it. In The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir focuses attention on women in all stages of life and throughout history. The method was revolutionary. Never had there been such an extensive study on the subject. She collected every scrap of empirical information she could find and came out with the conclusion that wherever and whenever women function in society, a basic inequality with men exists.